Episode 6: Why the brain can create the sound of tinnitus or tinnitus. Now, this is an educational discussion based on lived experiences, my own, and reputable sources, not medical advice. To understand tinnitus more clearly, it helps to look at how the brain processes sound signals in the first place. Persistent tinnitus can feel confusing because the sound appears to exist without any clear source. Yet the experience itself is not random. It emerges from the way the auditory system and the brain processes signals, especially when normal hearing input has changed. The auditory system is designed to constantly monitor sound. Tiny sensory cells in the inner ear convert vibration into electrical signals, which then travel along the auditory nerve to the brain. Under normal conditions, this system is very balanced. Sound comes in, the signal travels upward, and the brain interprets it as part of the environment. But when the incoming signal changes, sometimes through hearing loss, sometimes through subtle damage to the sensory cells, the brain receives less information than it expects to. And then, when that happens, the brain does something quite interesting. It begins to increase internal gain. Internal gain is essentially the brain turning up its sensitivity to sound signals. It is similar to how a radio amplifier might increase volume when a station signal becomes weak. The system is attempting to compensate. The result is that neural activity with the auditory pathways becomes more noticeable. And sometimes that increased activity is interpreted as a sound. This is one of the reasons tinnitus is often described as a perception rather than a physical noise. The brain is interpreting patterns of activity that resemble sound, even though no external sound is present. Many researchers compare this to phantom limb sensations, where the brain continues to produce sensations from a limb that is no longer there. In tinnitus, the auditory system may be responding to reduced input by generating activity that fills the gap. That does not mean something dangerous is happening. In most cases, it simply reflects the brain trying to maintain balance in a sensory system that prefers constant input. This is why tinnitus can vary so much between individuals. The exact pattern of hearing change, neural activity, and brain response differs from person to person. For some people, the sound resembles a high-pitched tone. For others, it might be a hiss, a ringing, or a gentle electrical sound. The important point is that the experience is shaped by the neural interpretation, not by a physical noise source inside the head. Understanding this mechanism can help explain another common observation. Tinnitus is often more noticeable in quiet environments. When the surroundings are silent, there is less external sound competing for the attention. The brain naturally scans for sensory input, and in that quiet space, the internally generated signal becomes easier to notice. Background sound is present, the auditory system has more information to process. Environmental noise, even at low levels, can partially mask or blend with the tinnitus signal. This is why gentle background sound, such as a fan, soft music, or outdoor ambience, can sometimes make tinnitus less intrusive. The brain is simply receiving more normal auditory input. There is another layer to this process as well. The auditory system does not operate in isolation. It is connected to many other parts of the brain, including areas involved in attention, memory, and emotional processing. When a sound is interpreted as important or threatening, the brain tends to prioritize it. Attention becomes focused on that signal. This can unintentionally amplify the awareness of tinnitus. In the early stages, especially, the brain may treat the new sound as something that needs monitoring. That heightened attention can make the perception feel louder or more intrusive than the underlying signal actually is. Over time, however, many people experience a gradual shift in how the brain responds. As the sound becomes familiar and less associated with danger or uncertainty, the brain often begins to filter it more efficiently. The process is sometimes described as habituous. Habituous does not mean the sound necessarily disappears. Instead, the brain learns that the signal does not require attention. Much like the hum of a refrigerator or distant traffic, it becomes part of the background. And when something becomes background information, the brain naturally stops prioritizing it as important. This is an important concept because it explains why tinnitus often becomes less intrusive over time, even if the underlying signals remains. The brain is extremely good at adapting to sensory information that proves to be harmless. There is a nuance that researchers increasingly emphasize. Tinnitus is not only about hearing loss. While hearing changes are a very common trigger, tinnitus can also be influenced by how the brain processes attention and sensory information more broadly. For example, fatigue, stress, and heightened alertness can make internal signals more noticeable. This does not mean those factors cause tinnitus directly. Rather, they can influence how strongly the brain registers existing signals. If the nervous system is in a heightened state of vigilance, subtle sensations, whether auditory or physical, may feel more prominent. Conversely, when the nervous system is calm and attention is directed elsewhere, the same signal may fade into the background. This relationship between perception and attention is a normal feature of brain function. The brain is constantly prioritizing information. It decides when or which signals deserve focus and which can safely be ignored. Tinnitus becomes intrusive primarily when it remains within the focus of that system. Once the brain categorizes it as unimportant background input, its perceived intensity often decreases. Another point worth understanding is that the brain sound processing networks are highly interconnected. Auditory regions communicate with areas involved in spatial awareness, emotional evaluation, and pattern recognition. When tinnitus first appears, the brain may interpret it as an unfamiliar signal that requires analysis. Familiarity changes the way signals are processed. Repeated exposure without negative consequences gradually teaches the brain that the signal does not require ongoing monitoring. The shift in interpretation significantly reduces the subjective burden of tinnitus. In other words, the signal itself may remain relatively stable, but the brain's response to it evolves. This is part of the reason educational understanding is often helpful. When the brain interprets a signal as non-threatening, the attention system tends to relax. And when attention relaxes, perception frequently softens. None of this suggests that tinnitus is purely psychological. The auditory system and the brain are both involved. It is more accurate to say tinnitus is a perceptual experience generated within the nervous system. The signal arises from patterns of neural activity and the brain interprets those patterns as sound. This is similar to how all sound is ultimately perceived. Even when we hear external noise, the experience itself still occurs within the brain's auditory cortex. Sound waves enter the ear, but what we consciously perceive is the brain's interpretation of those signals. Tinnitus simply reflects internal activity being interpreted in the same way. Understanding this perceptive can make the experience feel less mysterious. It highlights that tinnitus is connected to normal brain process, particularly those related to sensory balance and signal interpretation. And while the initial appearance of tinnitus can feel surprising or unsettling, the brain's ability to adapt should not be underestimated. Across many sensory systems, the brain regularly learns to filter information that proves irrelevant. The capacity is part of what allows people to function in complex environments without being overwhelmed by the constant sensory input. The auditory system is no exception. Over time, the brain becomes very skilled at deciding which sounds deserve attention and which can remain in the background. For many people, tinnitus gradually becomes one of those background signals. Not something that dominates awareness, but something that simply exists within the broader sensory landscape. And when the brain reaches that point, the experience often becomes far less intrusive than it initially seemed. The sound itself may not have changed dramatically. What has changed is the brain's relationship with it. And that shift in interpretation is one of the most powerful aspects of how the auditory system adapts. Thanks for listening to this episode from the David Health Channel.